Temp nurses who skip proper billing protocols cost this hospital thousands in lost revenue. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before his entire world collapsed. Seattle General's fluorescent lights buzz overhead like trapped insects as Rachel Torres stands motionless at the medication cart, her fingers steady on the 4-line requisition form despite the tremor in her left hand, a tremor only visible when she thinks no one is watching. The trembling was not fear. It was restraint. She's been a temp nurse here for 17 months, which means she is invisible. Which means she is safe. Which means she has learned to make herself smaller with each shift, to move through these corridors like water finding the lowest point, to speak only when spoken to and never to make eye contact with the attending physicians who treat the temporary staff like equipment that broke down. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mixes with something sharper today. Someone spilled coffee near the break room, and beneath that, the faint copper tang of blood from Trauma Bay 3. She breathes through her mouth. The smell is information. Pain is information. This is a thing she tells herself on days when the weight of what she knows about her own hand sits too heavy against her sternum. In her locker sits a pair of combat boots. The leather is cracked from Ramadi heat. Sand still catches in the treads despite the 13 times she has cleaned them. Some mornings she touches them before her shift begins, just her fingertips against the rough fabric, the way other people touch crucifixes or photographs. She does not know why. She tells herself it is muscle memory. She tells herself it is nothing. Her hospital badge reads Torres, R, temporary RN with no other credentials listed. No specializations. No commendations. No history. The version of Rachel Torres that exists in this building is a woman in her early 40s with dark circles under her eyes and a 12-year-old daughter waiting at home who asks too many questions about why mom cries in the car sometimes. The version of Rachel Torres that does not exist anymore is someone entirely different. Someone with a rank, a service record, and a photograph that appeared in military newspapers 17 years ago with a caption redacted before publication. She has learned to answer phones as a Torres. She has learned to say "I'm sorry, doctor" when she has nothing to apologize for. She has learned to absorb criticism the way hospital tile absorbs blood, complete, total, without staining the surface. Grand rounds happen at 7:22 a.m. on Thursdays. Rachel is restocking the crash cart when Dr. James Whitfield emerges from the stairwell with his entourage of 5 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He wears a $4,000 suit in a hospital where everyone else wears scrubs, which is its own kind of violence. His shoes click against the tile, Italian leather, the sound of someone who has never had to move quietly. He is 53 years old and handsome in the way men become when they have spent their whole lives being told they are right about everything. His hands are soft. She notices things like this. It is the kind of noticing that kept her alive in places that did not exist on maps. Whitfield stops mid-stride when he sees Rachel. He smiles. It is not a kind smile. "Ah, perfect," he says, turning to his residents. "This is exactly what I wanted to show you. Come here, Torres." Rachel moves toward him with her shoulders squared, her face a professional mask. She has learned that expression carefully. It takes practice. Most people cry or get angry when they are about to be humiliated. She has learned to go very still instead, like an animal that knows predators hunt motion. "Gentlemen, this is a temporary nursing staff member. You'll notice the hospital ID, no subspecialties, no certifications beyond the minimum. Temp nurses like Torres are rotating through our facility constantly, and do you know what happens when temporary staff skip proper billing protocols?" He does not wait for an answer. We lose revenue. Thousands of dollars in lost revenue because someone can't be bothered to document supply usage correctly. It costs this hospital money. It costs our department funding. It costs all of you salary increases that could fund your continuing education. The residents stare at her. One of them, a young man, maybe 28, with kind eyes, looks away. Torres here likely doesn't understand the financial responsibility that comes with working in a medical institution. Temporary staff don't get the same training, you see. They don't grasp the bigger picture. Rachel says nothing. Her hands are at her sides. Her breathing is controlled. She thinks about the sandstorm outside of FOB Shank in 2006, how the sky turned yellow and everyone stopped moving, and how the silence inside the shelter was so complete you could hear your own pulse. She thinks about that silence now, pulls it around herself like armor. Whitfield's words move across her like wind across sand. I want you all to remember this, Whitfield continues, gesturing toward her as if she is a piece of equipment. This is what happens when we don't maintain standards. This is what happens when we let temporary people think they belong in a place like Seattle General. He turns away. The residents follow. Rachel's jaw clenches almost imperceptibly, but her hands remain steady. She returns to the crash cart. She restocks it with methodical precision. 18 minutes later, she has logged every single item with perfect documentation. She has anticipated exactly what Whitfield will say next because she has studied him. She studies everyone. It is not a choice anymore. It is how she survives. The vending machine is on the 3rd floor, near the pediatric wing. Rachel is restocking her water bottle at 9:14 a.m. when Whitfield approaches with his colleague, Dr. Marcus Sterling, a man whose power source is political, whose brother-in-law is on the hospital board, whose word carries weight in ways that have nothing to do with medical expertise. Sterling walks like a man who has never waited for anything in his life. Torres, Whitfield calls out. His voice has that particular texture that tells her this is deliberate. This is not coincidence. A moment. She turns. The vending machine is behind her. The hallway stretches in both directions, one way toward the main wards, the other toward pediatrics. 2 orderlies stand 30 feet away, pretending to examine a clipboard. Rachel recognizes them. They are friends of Whitfield. This is important information. This means what happens next is planned. I've been reviewing the supply requisitions, Whitfield says, moving closer. Specifically the morning of the 23rd. You requisitioned for full-line kits that same morning, is that correct? Yes, Rachel says. And you documented their usage? Yes. Show me. She does not hesitate. She pulls her phone from her scrub pocket. She has learned to keep the completed forms photographed, laminated in her memory, and pulls up the tablet log. Her movements are smooth. She does not rush. She displays the documentation with her phone angled so he can see clearly. Date. Time. Patient initials. Specific for gauge used. The form is complete. Perfect. There is nothing to find. Whitfield stares at the screen. She watches his eyes scan the information. She watches the moment he realizes there is nothing there to criticize. I've been hearing about supply discrepancies, he says, but his voice has changed. It has become louder instead of more confident. This is the sound of a man who is running out of ammunition. These things have a way of appearing in an audit, Torres. You understand that? They catch up with people eventually. The documentation is complete, Rachel says. Her voice is quiet. It has been trained for years to be quiet. It has been trained to be the kind of voice that does not carry authority, that does not demand anything, that occupies only the space it is given. Every supply is logged. Every patient is documented. There is no discrepancy. The orderlies snicker. She hears it, a small sound, the sound of followers understanding that their leader has been rebuffed. This is what happens when you are good at what you do. People become angry that you cannot be broken. Whitfield's jaw tightens. For a moment, just for a moment, she sees the thing beneath his surface. The thing that understands, on some cellular level, that she is not actually what she appears to be. But he does not have language for what he is seeing. He only knows that something is off about her, that something in the way she stands is wrong for a temporary nurse, that something in the steadiness of her hands tells a story his brain cannot quite articulate. We'll see, he says finally, and walks away. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is that Rachel knows why he is so determined to push her. She has spent 17 months watching his patterns. She has a gift for patterns. It was trained into her, beaten into her, refined across 15 combat deployments where the people who survived were the ones who noticed what did not fit. And what doesn't fit is this: Whitfield is ordering cardiac enzyme panels. Lots of them. On stable patients. On people whose clinical presentation does not warrant it. She has documented 73 unnecessary panels over the past 8 months. Each one generates a lab fee. Each lab fee has a kickback attached to it. She is certain of this because she has seen the same names appear on invoices, the same contractors, the same pattern that smells like corruption. The pattern smells like money. He is not going to let her stay. He is going to find a way to remove her before she connects the dots. Room 347 is at the end of the pediatric corridor. The boy inside is 8 years old. His name is Marcus. He is the reason Rachel moved to San Diego 3 years ago, though she did not know it until she saw his face on a roster, and something inside her that had been dormant for 2 decades woke up all at once. He is mute. The chart says selective mutism. The doctors say trauma. Rachel knows better. Rachel knows that sometimes silence is a choice, and sometimes silence is a survival mechanism, and sometimes silence is the only way to stay alive when everything else has been taken. She passes his room at 11:13 a.m. during her routine. He is sitting by the window, looking out at the parking lot where cars move in geometric patterns below. When he sees her, his head turns. His dark eyes, they are exactly like his father's eyes, which he remembers like it was yesterday even though yesterday was 20 years ago, track her movement down the hallway. She does not stop. She does not acknowledge him. This is important. This is how she protects him. But when she is directly in front of his window, she feels the weight of his attention like hands. She feels the moment of recognition. She feels him knowing. 20 years ago in Ramadi, in a building that collapsed after an IED blast on Al-Anbar Street, Rachel pulled a newborn from the rubble. The baby was covered in dust so thick it looked like he was made of sand. There was a man screaming her name, a Navy SEAL, her team leader, the one person on the planet who knew what she actually was, and she handed the baby to him through the flames because there were other people inside, deeper inside, and the building was still falling. That man died 8 years ago in a car accident on Interstate 5 in California, coming home from a deployment he should never have had to do because the government that said she was dead had sent him on another tour anyway. Punishment for knowing her, for loving her like a sister, for carrying her burden in his bones. His son is still alive. Rachel does not break stride. She continues down the hallway. But she presses her hand against the wall, just for a moment, just enough to ground herself. The wall is cool. It is real. Everything else is a dream she is having inside a life that is not actually hers. The next voice she hears is the monitor alarm from pediatric bed 6. A child is desaturating. The alarm is sharp, electronic, a sound that cuts through everything else. She does not run. She walks. But her hands are already moving, already reaching for equipment, already preparing for what she knows is about to happen. She has no idea, as she moves toward that alarm, that this moment will change everything. She has no idea that the boy in room 347 is about to suffer a cardiac crisis that should not be survivable. She has no idea that when she saves him, she will trigger a chain of events that begins with her firing and ends with the collapse of Dr. Whitfield's career. She only knows that there is a child who needs her. And there are some things, even after 20 years of invisibility, that Rachel Torres still knows how to do. The office door closed with the kind of soft precision that made Rachel's spine straighten. Dr. Whitfield sat behind his desk, mahogany, probably real, the kind of furniture that announced money and authority in the same breath, and slid 3 forms across the polished surface toward her. His fingers remained on the papers for a moment longer than necessary, a small display of dominance. Rachel had seen this move before. Not in a hospital. In places that didn't exist on any map, where men with power used furniture and paperwork the same way they used fear. Continued insubordination, he read aloud, tapping the first form. Failure to follow chain of command. Unprofessional conduct. He looked up, his eyes searching for something, a flinch, a tremor, the small crack that would let him inside. One more incident, Miss Torres, and security will escort you out of this building in front of the entire nursing staff. Do you understand me? Rachel's hands rested on the chair armrest. Her knuckles had begun to whiten, but that was where the reaction stopped. Her voice emerged flat and calm, each word measured like a surgical instrument. I understand, Doctor. I don't think you do. He leaned back in his chair, which squeaked slightly under the shift of his weight. You were hired as temporary staff. Temporary? That means you serve at the pleasure of this hospital's administration. My administration? The paperwork you filled out? Fabricated dates. Shifts you claim to have worked flawlessly. He held up the second form. My residents witnessed your negligence during rounds. I have their statements. The lies were almost beautiful in their construction. Rachel recognized the architecture of them, how he built each accusation on a foundation of institutional authority, how he knew that a temp nurse without permanent standing would have no one to corroborate her version of events. She said nothing. Her face remained the mask it had been since she'd learned to control her expressions in a military hospital in Kandahar 20 years ago, holding soldiers who would never go home and smiling at their mothers on video calls. The transfer is effective immediately, Whitfield continued, sliding a fourth document across his desk. This one was different, an official hospital notification. Geriatric wing. Day shift. You'll work under Nurse Supervisor Dalton, who has been informed of your pattern of infractions. Any further incidents will result in immediate termination and a report to your temp agency. Rachel's eye scanned the document. The transfer order was signed by the hospital's director of nursing, someone she'd never met, someone Whitfield apparently had on speed dial. The strategic move was clean. Brilliant, actually. By moving her to geriatrics, he'd removed her from the pediatric floor entirely. No more proximity to room 347. No more charts to review. No more opportunities to connect the dots between his unnecessary cardiac panels and the lab contractor's kickback scheme that she'd been quietly documenting for 3 weeks. He'd seen her looking. And he'd acted. You can go, Whitfield said, turning his attention to his computer monitor. The dismissal was absolute. Rachel stood, collected the documents, and walked toward the door with the same measured stride she'd maintained through ambushes and mortar fire. She didn't run. She didn't protest. She didn't let the anger show anywhere on her face, though it was burning somewhere deep in her chest like a thermite charge. The hallway outside his office stretched in both directions, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel meaningless. Rachel kept walking. The paperwork crinkled in her hands as she moved toward the elevator bank. The geriatric wing was 3 floors down and worlds away from the children's ward. 3 floors down meant she'd never see that boy again. Never know if his mother had the answers she was looking for. Never understand the impossible recognition in his eyes when they'd locked onto hers in the doorway of room 347. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. She stepped inside alone. The descent took 43 seconds. Rachel counted every one of them, a habit from operations where timing meant the difference between extraction and catastrophe. When the doors opened, she was met with the smell of aging bodies and institutional lavender, the place where people went to run out of time, one assisted living room at a time. Nurse Supervisor Dalton was waiting at the station, a woman in her 50s with the tight expression of someone who'd been given instructions to watch a problem employee. You're the transfer, Dalton said, not quite meeting Rachel's eyes. Whitfield called down. Said you'd need close supervision. You'll be handling the East Wing, rooms 401 through 416. Report your every move to me. Documentation on every patient, every medication, every supply. I don't want surprises. Understood, Rachel replied. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still the careful, deferential tone she'd perfected over weeks of absorbing Whitfield's contempt. The mask was holding. But something underneath it, something that had been trained in ways that no civilian hospital could understand, was watching the architecture of this trap and calculating how to collapse it from the inside. The day shift passed in a blur of elderly patients and routine medications. Rachel moved through the rooms like a ghost, her hands efficient, her notes precise. Every medication logged. Every vital sign recorded. Every supply accounted for with timestamps. She was giving Whitfield and Dalton nothing to hold against her. But she was also, quietly and systematically, documenting everything. The pattern of his orders had become clear to her in just 3 weeks. The unnecessary tests. The billing codes that didn't match the clinical presentation. The way he called in favors from a lab contractor whose name appeared on a consulting fee list she'd found in the hospital's public financial records. By 5 o'clock, Rachel had finished her shift. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Her personal bag was in her locker, her wallet, her keys, and underneath those, the pair of worn combat boots she kept in a plastic bag. The leather was cracked at the heel. The laces were tied in the same knot she'd learned at Fort Sam Houston, 20 years ago. She didn't touch them. She never touched them while she was at the hospital. They belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The drive home took 31 minutes. Rachel didn't take the freeway. She took surface streets through San Diego, past neighborhoods where families were setting dinner tables and kids were doing homework, past the ordinary world that existed in the spaces between her two lives. The rain started around mile 17, soft at first, then heavier, until the windshield wipers couldn't quite keep up. Thunder rolled across the city in the distance like something vast and angry shifting in its sleep. Her apartment was quiet. Her daughter, Maya, was supposed to be at soccer practice until 6. Rachel had planned to be back before her, had planned to have her emotions compartmentalized and her mother face on. But Maya came through the door at 4:17, soaked from the rain, her coach having cancelled practice because of the weather. Rachel was at the kitchen table by then, still in her scrubs. She hadn't meant to cry. Crying was inefficient. Crying was the opposite of compartmentalization. But her hands were shaking, not from fear, not from the escalation, but from the specific kind of rage that comes from being systematically erased by someone smaller than you, someone with less courage, someone who needed an institution to give him permission to do what he was doing. Maya stopped in the doorway. She was 12, old enough to recognize the specific quality of her mother's silence, the way she was staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Mom? Why are you home? Your shift doesn't end until 7. Rachel didn't answer immediately. How could she? How could she explain that she'd been transferred? That she was being professionally buried? That the boy in room 347, the child whose mother wore a gold star pin, the child whose eyes held a recognition that should have been impossible, was now sealed off from her by hospital hierarchy and strategic reassignment? How could she explain that the man doing this to her was competent enough to cover his tracks, careful enough to build a case against her before she could build one against him? "I got transferred," Rachel said finally. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow, unfamiliar. "Geriatric wing. Day shift." "But you like peds," Maya said. She sat down across from her mother at the table, her school uniform still damp from the rain. "You said the kids needed you." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Sometimes what we want doesn't matter. Sometimes the system decides for us." That night, after Maya was asleep, Rachel opened her closet and pulled down the plastic bag. The combat boots were heavier than they should have been, as if they carried weight that transcended physics. The leather still smelled like dust and diesel and the particular sand of Ramadi, the kind of sand that got into every crevice and stayed there for years. She held one boot in her hands, feeling the shape of her own foot in the leather, remembering the woman who had worn them last, the one who had pulled an infant from rubble while bullets chewed through the walls around her. That woman had been ordered to disappear. To become invisible. To become nothing but a temporary nurse in a hospital where a man named Whitfield could use her as an example and then systematically destroy her without consequence. But that woman was still in the boots. And she was running out of reasons to stay quiet. But that wasn't the lowest point yet. Not even close. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who hadn't slept in 36 hours. Rachel sat alone at the laminate table, the pediatric chart spread in front of her like a confession waiting to happen. Her hands, scarred from things she couldn't talk about, moved through the files with the precision of someone trained to find inconsistencies in chaos. Room 347. 8 years old. Admitted with pneumonia. Stable oxygen saturation. Viral markers negative. Simple case. The kind that resolved in 4 days without intervention. Then she saw Whitfield's order. Troponin panel. BNP. Complete metabolic workup. Cardiac enzymes. The full battery. Ordered this morning at 6:06 a.m., for hours after the boy was admitted. The kind of test panel that generated 11 different billable line items and triggered an automatic lab contractor referral worth $438 to the private cardiology consortium that shared profit margins with Whitfield's personal consulting firm. She'd seen the pattern before. 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Stable patients who didn't need intervention suddenly getting expensive diagnostic workups that never resulted in treatment modifications. Just billing codes. Just money flowing upward from the lab to the contractor to Whitfield's offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She knew because she'd watched the charges appear. She'd documented them. She'd been building the case in a secured encrypted file on her personal laptop, careful not to leave digital footprints on hospital servers. The boy in room 347 had congenital heart disease. That part was true. But his condition was stable. Monitored. Not acute. Not requiring a full cardiac enzyme panel to diagnose or manage. This wasn't medicine. This was predation dressed up in clinical language. Rachel's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly as she photographed the order with her personal phone, her movements economical and efficient. No trembling. No anger showing on her face. Just documentation. Just evidence. She'd been trained to gather intelligence under pressure, to remain invisible while absorbing information that could change lives. The photocopies went into her scrub pocket alongside the challenge coin she kept there, the one stamped with a call sign she wasn't supposed to remember anymore. She should have felt afraid. Should have felt the cold creeping sensation of knowing she was about to become a liability to a man with institutional power and no conscience. Instead, what she felt was clarity. The same clarity she'd felt standing in the rubble of Ramadi 20 years ago, holding a newborn infant through smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands, passing that small warm weight to a seal whose eyes were red from dust and tears. Some things transcended reassignment orders and fabricated write-ups and the calculated humiliation designed to make her disappear. Some things mattered more than survival. The first alarm came at 2:14 p.m. Soft at first, the kind of gentle alert that means a monitor is asking for attention. Then the second alarm. Then the rapid response tone that cuts through hospital infrastructure like a knife through fabric. Pediatrics. 3rd floor. Rachel was 3 floors below in the geriatric wing, restocking for supplies in the supply room, when her hands went still. She knew that alarm. Knew the cadence. Knew the precise frequency of a code blue on a pediatric unit because she'd heard it in her nightmares for 2 decades. The mute boy. She didn't think it. She knew it. The same way she'd known, from across a collapsed building in 2004, that a specific infant was still alive under the rubble. The next 30 seconds unfolded in hyperclarity. Whitfield's reassignment order echoing, "You are not authorized on the pediatric floor. Security will escort you from the premises." Her temporary badge, downgraded, access restricted. Her feet, planted on the tile in front of the supply cart she'd been organizing, the one loaded with sterile dressings and normal saline and all the mundane equipment of care. The 2nd floor nurses looked up, attention drawn to the overhead code announcement. Room 347. Pediatrics. Code blue. She could see it written on their faces. Another child. Another family about to fracture. 90 seconds. That's how long she stood there. 90 seconds of her hands gripping the edge of the supply cart hard enough that her knuckles went white. 90 seconds of her rational mind explaining the institutional mathematics. She was nobody. She had no authority. She'd been removed from that floor for a reason. Whitfield wanted her gone. Whitfield needed her gone. One more violation and her temp contract was terminated, her references destroyed, her ability to work in medicine erased in a city where she had no other identity, no other way to survive. 90 seconds of her understanding that sometimes the system worked exactly as designed to protect people like Whitfield and silence people like her. Then her feet moved. The stairwell was faster than the elevator. 14 steps down. Her rubber-soled shoes made almost no sound on the concrete steps. The access door to pediatrics swung open and the smell hit her first, the particular cocktail of pediatric crisis. Antiseptic and fear and the ozone scent that comes from a defibrillator charging. The nurse's station was chaos orchestrated with precision. 2 residents moving with the stiff uncertainty of people who were following protocols without understanding them. A respiratory therapist fumbling with ventilator settings. The crash cart positioned outside room 347, its drawers open like a wound. And Whitfield, standing in the doorway, his frame filling it completely, his voice sharp and administrative, continue compressions. Epi going in at 2:14. He didn't see her approach. Didn't sense the shift in air pressure that comes before presence announces itself. Rachel moved closer and saw the child's mother in the corner, her hands pressed against her mouth, her entire body vibrating with the frequency of a parent watching their child's life separate from their body. The mute boy's chest was exposed, small and pale, a resident's hands pumping against his sternum with compressions that generated the hollow thump of a rhythm without perfusion. The monitor above his bed showed the jagged electrical chaos of ventricular fibrillation. The flat EKG lines were spiking like mountains and dropping like cliffs. The cardiac output was 0. The brain was dying. 1 minute of this and permanent damage. 2 minutes and he became a body instead of a boy. Whitfield's phone was already in his hand. Security to pediatrics. We have an unauthorized, his voice stopped as he processed her presence. His eyes moved from her face to her expression and saw something there that made his pupils dilate. Something in her stillness. Something in the way she was looking at the crash cart, at the child, at the rhythm flatline on the monitor. Torres. His voice dropped an octave, became edged with something that resembled fear. You are not authorized on this floor. Leave immediately or I'm calling security. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't answer. Just kept moving toward the cart with the precision of someone whose training overrode institutional hierarchy. The crash cart held what she needed. A number 11 scalpel blade, already sterile. The defibrillator pads useless now, the child's rhythm had deteriorated beyond electrical therapy. The problem wasn't electrical. The problem was mechanical. His small heart was failing because something had broken in its structure, some malformation that Whitfield's unnecessary cardiac panel was probably designed to hide until the boy coded and died from a unnatural cause that no one would question. The order made sense now. Preemptive diagnosis. Planned death. Insurance money. Billing finality. Security coming up, Whitfield said into his phone, his voice climbing. ETA 2 minutes. The monitor showed the boy's oxygen saturation dropping. 68%. 64. The compressions weren't generating output. The small chest rose and fell mechanically, but the blood wasn't moving. The brain wasn't being perfused. Every second that passed was a minute of life being erased. Rachel's hands were already moving toward the sterile field. Her mind had calculated what she was about to do in the 1.3 seconds it took to cross the room. A left anterolateral thoracotomy. Standard field procedure from the 160th SAW protocol she'd trained in before Afghanistan. Before Ramadi. Before they'd buried her records and told her to disappear into civilian life and forget that Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had ever existed. She reached past the resident. "Step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her voice had changed. Had dropped an octave and become the voice of someone who'd given orders on battlefields and seen them followed instantly because the alternative was death. The resident stepped back without question. Muscle memory was a weapon more reliable than any rifle. The scalpel was in her hand. The boy's exposed chest gleamed under the surgical lights. She located the fifth intercostal space, the landmark where any field medic learned to enter the thoracic cavity, and pressed the blade downward through skin that was still warm with the blood that was supposed to be moving but wasn't. The next sounds were the wet hiss of the incision, the precise tearing of fascial layers, the resistance of ribs that still had 30 years of growth left in them. Her hands moved like she'd done this 1,000 times. She had done this 817 times. The number was precise. She'd counted. She'd documented every field thoracotomy, every time she'd cracked someone's chest in the dirt and sand and darkness of places that didn't officially exist, places where the rules of civilian medicine bent into the rules of survival. The pericardium was tight, restrictive. She incised it with the second cut. The boy's heart was visible now, small as a plum, and the reason for the arrest was suddenly, terribly, crystalline clear. The left main coronary artery was attached to the right side of the aorta. Anomalous origin of the left coronary artery. The kind of congenital defect that killed athletes and children without warning. The kind that Whitfield's cardiac enzyme panel would have diagnosed post-mortem, a tragedy, moving on to the next patient. The kind that could have been detected by proper pediatric screening but wasn't, because screening would have prevented the billing codes. Her hand entered the thoracic cavity. Direct cardiac massage. The heart was in her palm, small and failing and suddenly, unbelievably, responsive. She massaged it with the technique they'd taught her at Dam Neck, Virginia, the place that didn't officially exist either. Gentle, steady pressure. The kind of touch that communicated, not yet. Not today. The monitor began to change. The flat line became spikes. The spikes became rhythm. Organized. Electrical. Real. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. Whitfield's phone was still in his hand, slack now, forgotten. His mouth was open. His face had gone the color of old bone. Because he was watching a temp nurse, a woman he'd been engineering to silence, save a child's life using a procedure that required training he couldn't have imagined she possessed. The boy's mother had stopped trembling. Was standing now, her hand pressed against the window of room 347, her eyes fixed on the small chest moving with breath for the first time in 90 seconds. The oxygen saturation began to climb. 68%. 72. 81. 94. Holding steady. The heart, in Rachel's hand, beating with the rhythm of something that had been given a second chance. She didn't withdraw her hand immediately. Held it there for 5 more seconds, feeling the pulse recover, feeling the small organ's electrical activity stabilize. Only then did she step back, remove her hand from the cavity, and turn to face the room. Her eyes met Whitfield's. The temporary nurse, the one he'd humiliated in grand rounds, the one he'd fired from the pediatric floor, the one he'd been planning to erase from institutional memory, was still standing there, her hands covered in blood that belonged to a child he'd been planning to let die. The code blue alarm shattered the afternoon quiet like a gunshot through glass. Rachel's hands froze mid-chart entry. Pediatrics. 3rd floor. Room 347. The alarm's mechanical wail pulled at something deep in her chest, a frequency only certain bodies could hear. She didn't question it. She was moving before her mind caught up, scrubs rustling like wind through dry leaves as she crossed the nursing station at a controlled walk that felt like running inside her own skin. The stairwell door swung open without a sound. Her boots, the worn ones she'd laced this morning, the same boots that had touched soil in 5 countries, took the stairs 2 at a time. Her heart rate climbed steady as O2 saturation numbers, 100, 105, 110. Not fear. Preparation. The body remembering what the mind had spent 20 years trying to forget. Room 347's door was still closing when she arrived. The monitor screamed its flat accusation. The boy lay still as marble on the pediatric bed, his small chest silent, his lips the color of twilight. The attending from day shift was frozen beside him, his hands hovering uselessly, his mouth moving words that had no authority. No code team yet. ETA maybe 90 seconds if they were fast. Maybe longer if they weren't. Rachel's hands moved before anyone acknowledged she was there. She didn't ask permission. She didn't pause to introduce herself or check the chain of command. She reached for the crash cart scalpel with the precision of someone who had done this exact thing in the dark, in dust storms, in rooms where the sound of mortar fire provided the only percussion. The blade was cool against her palm. Good. She liked cool things. Cool things didn't shake. What are you doing? The attending's voice cracked like breaking ice. She didn't answer. There was no time for words. There was only time for the intercostal space between ribs 4 and 5, for the horizontal incision through muscle and fascia, for the hiss of air as she opened the boy's chest cavity with the kind of controlled violence that looked like meditation to anyone who didn't understand what they were watching. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. Her breathing didn't change. Pain is data. Blood is information. The small punctured lung was data. The distended pericardium was data. The absent heartbeat was data that needed answering. She placed both hands around the boy's heart and began direct cardiac massage, her palms closing around the organ with the kind of intimate knowledge that only came from field surgeries in places that didn't exist on any map, in sites where the GPS coordinates had been classified before she was born. She didn't squeeze. She massaged. Long, deliberate compressions like she was speaking to the heart in a language older than words. Her muscle memory was flawless because her body had done this 17 times in the mountains outside Ramadi, had done this with her own hands covered in blood that belonged to Marines and soldiers and translators who had names and families and futures that depended on her not thinking about anything except the rhythm. The monitor registered her first compression. A flicker. A lie? She continued. 2 compressions. 3. Her other hand found the apex of his left ventricle and began working in concert with her right palm, milking the organ back to life with the kind of gentleness that required absolute strength. The attending stood paralyzed, his career suddenly irrelevant in the presence of someone doing something that shouldn't be possible. The monitor continued its complaint, then, 20 seconds into her massage, it hiccuped. Sinus rhythm. The boy's heart contracted beneath her palms. Once. Again. A third time, all on its own, as if it was remembering how to live. She withdrew her hands and stepped back in the same motion, her breathing still steady, her face still blank as water. The attending moved finally, muscle memory overriding shock, his hands reaching for the endotracheal tube, his voice calling for medications with the tentative confidence of someone pretending he hadn't just watched something impossible. Dr. Whitfield arrived as the full code team flooded through the door, arriving in the moment of salvation like a vulture finding the feast already in progress. His eyes went from the monitors to Rachel's hands, still wet with the boy's blood, and something in his face changed. Not gratitude. Not relief. The look of a predator realizing the smaller animal in the corner had teeth. He stepped into the hallway while the team worked, and Rachel watched from the corner of the room as he pulled his phone from his pocket. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment she picked up that scalpel. The unwritten rule of institutional medicine is absolute: you don't step outside the hierarchy, no matter what the cost. Especially when stepping outside the hierarchy makes your superior look inadequate. She'd just saved a child's life with her bare hands, and in the calculus of hospital politics, that was worse than letting him die. Whitfield's phone call lasted 90 seconds. She heard fragments. Massive liability. Unauthorized procedure. Medical board investigation. My office, now. The last part was delivered to the attending, not the hospital operator. Command presence. The voice of someone used to being obeyed. 2 hours later, an investigator from the State Medical Board sat across from Rachel in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and institutional fear. Whitfield had called in favors. He'd contacted her temp agency within 30 minutes, flagging her file as a liability. He'd activated every network contact, every medical school roommate, every vestige of privilege accumulated through 63 years of privilege accumulating privilege. The investigator laid out his findings with the precision of someone building a case. You performed an invasive surgical procedure without authorization. You acted outside your scope of practice. You exposed this hospital to potential malpractice liability exceeding 7 figures. The child's heart wasn't beating, Rachel said. Her voice was quiet. Composed. The voice of someone who had learned that words were less powerful than silence, and silence was less powerful than the absence of defense. That's not the point, the investigator said. The point is procedure. The point is hierarchy. The point is that doctors make medical decisions, and nurses execute them. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. She didn't argue. Arguing would mean explaining her training. Explaining her training meant saying words like the Joint Special Operations Command and Master Chief Petty Officer and Combat Medic Certification in Surgical Trauma, and the moment those words left her mouth, the Navy's 20-year erasure would evaporate like water on hot asphalt. The moment anyone knew who she was, the whole careful construction of her civilian life would collapse. They would demand to know why her records were classified. They would make calls to people who didn't answer phones. They would uncover the Ramadi operation and the political fallout that had led to her being buried in plain sight, handed new social security numbers and orders to never acknowledge her own history. So she sat in silence while Whitfield built his case, while the investigator documented her alleged negligence, while the hospital's legal team assembled to discuss damage control. She watched it happen the way a soldier watches incoming artillery, with the kind of detached acceptance that comes from having already survived worse. The phone call came at 4:15 in the afternoon. Human resources. Professional, apologetic, final. We've made the difficult decision to terminate your position, effective immediately, for gross violation of medical protocol and scope of practice. The words fell like dominoes. Severance. Final paycheck. Security escort to collect belongings. She listened without speaking, her free hand resting on the kitchen table where she sat, her apartment suddenly feeling like a room she'd never been in before. They handed her belongings in a cardboard box at 5:42. Stethoscope. Personal medication. The photo of her daughter from 3 years ago, before everything got complicated. The laminated temporary nurse certification that had gotten her through Seattle General's door in the first place. Someone had even included her shoes, the ones she'd changed out of, the regulation hospital clogs with the worn heels. The only thing they hadn't included was the combat boots she'd left in her locker, laced tight and waiting. She drove home without music, without thinking, her hands moving through traffic with the precision of long-practiced reflex. The hospital receding in her rearview mirror like a ship disappearing into fog. At home, she sat in her car in the driveway for 54 minutes without moving, her key still in the ignition, her hand still on the steering wheel, her body registering the absence of mission the way soldiers register the absence of sound. When she finally moved, she moved inside to the kitchen table, and she sat there in her blood-stained scrubs, her hands folded in front of her, her mind somewhere between Ramadi and San Diego, between the person she'd been and the person she'd become and the person she was being forced to become again. Her daughter Maya found her there 2 hours later, home early from school for the half-day she'd forgotten about, and the question came out small and confused, "Mom, why are you home? What happened to your—" Maya's voice broke off, looking at the scrubs, the cardboard box, the exhaustion written across Rachel's face like a map of every place she'd been that still had blood on its soil. "I lost my job," Rachel said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Why? You're the best nurse at that hospital. Everyone says so." Rachel looked at her daughter, this child who'd been born into a life where her mother was supposed to be invisible, where her mother's real name was classified, where her mother's accomplishments belonged to a country that had ordered her to forget them. She reached down and picked up the pair of worn combat boots from beside the chair, held them in her lap like they were sacred, like they were the only true thing left in the world. "Some boots," she said finally, "aren't meant for walking. They're meant for running. I just forgot which direction I was supposed to go." Maya didn't understand. Rachel didn't expect her to. But the boot sat in her hands like a question mark made of leather and history and classified memories, and in the kitchen's fluorescent light, with her daughter watching her from the doorway, Rachel Torres made a decision that would change everything in the next 72 hours. She was finished disappearing. 3 days of silence. 3 days of Rachel staring at the walls of her apartment while her daughter Maya moved through the rooms like a ghost, leaving glasses of water on the nightstand that Rachel never drank, leaving her presence without asking questions. 3 days of hands that had held lives together now folded in her lap, steady and still, waiting for something she couldn't name. The combat boots sat by the door. She couldn't bring herself to put them away. The call came at 4:17 p.m. on the third day. Not from the hospital. From a number she didn't recognize, a voice she'd never heard before, a man with an Iraqi accent, speaking broken English, asking for the Angel of Ramadi in the emergency department of Seattle General. The ER attending had looked confused. The man had persisted. "There is a nurse. A woman. She pulled me from the rubble in 2004. I know her voice. I know her hands. Please. I need her name." Rachel's phone went silent for 8 full seconds after the hospital administrator called her apartment. Then she packed nothing. She simply went. The administrator, a woman named Chen with kind eyes and the posture of someone carrying institutional weight, knocked on Rachel's apartment door at 6:42 p.m. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked in, found Rachel standing by the window, and said only, "He's asking for you. He says you saved his life. He says you saved his village." Rachel turned. Her face showed nothing. Her hands remained at her sides. "I don't know what you did," Chen said carefully, "but that man in the ER is refusing treatment until he speaks to you. The translator says he keeps calling you a call sign. Valkyrie. Does that mean anything to you?" The air in the apartment changed texture. Like pressure before a storm. Like the moment before an explosion, when everything holds its breath. "I'm driving you there," Chen said. It wasn't a request. The man was sitting upright in Trauma Bay 3, the left side of his face slack from the stroke, his right hand trembling as he gripped the bed rail. When he saw Rachel standing in the doorway, still in civilian clothes, her shoulders back, her breathing steady, his trembling stopped. His eye widened. He released the rail and reached for her with both hands. "Valkyrie," he whispered. "Valkyrie." Rachel moved to him without hesitation. She took his hands. They were rough and weathered and alive, and when he gripped her palms, something in his chest released. He spoke in rapid Arabic, mixing in fragments of English. "You pulled me from the rubble. You carried me through the smoke. You gave me back my life. 20 years I have waited to thank you. 20 years. Rachel's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. She didn't pull away. "My name is Amira Hassan," he said in careful English. "I was a translator. Coalition forces. You remember? You remember Jolan District?" She remembered. Her hands remembered. Her scars remembered. But her voice, when she spoke, was level. "You need treatment. Now. First you tell me. You are Valkyrie?" "I was," Rachel said quietly. "I'm not anymore." The translator gripped her hands harder. "You will always be. Always." But the next voice that changed everything didn't come from the ER. It came from the hospital lobby, where Rachel stood 43 minutes later, escorted back by Administrator Chen, both of them moving through the sliding glass doors as visiting hours compressed toward evening. The lobby was crowded in a way that made no sense. Staff gathered in clusters. Orderlies. Nurses. Respiratory therapists. Custodians. People who should have been working stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes on the elevator bank. The veteran security guard, a man named Mitchell with a silver beard and hands that had known weapons before they knew badge clips, stood at the center. He'd been stationed at Seattle General for 17 years. He recognized Rachel the moment she entered the lobby. He came to attention. His posture shifted. His shoulders squared. His right hand rose in a precise salute, moving from waist to temple with the fluid automation of muscle memory, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of ceremony. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. The lobby went silent. A silence so thick you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, 300 watts of white noise and held breath. Rachel's face didn't change. Her hand came up to her collarbone in a return salute, the motion automatic and precise, the gesture of someone who hadn't forgotten any of it, not the weight of rank, not the language of respect, not what it meant to be recognized by someone who understood what she had carried. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield, who stood near the information desk waiting for his evening rounds to begin. He watched the salute. He watched the gathered staff. He watched Rachel Torres, the temp nurse he'd humiliated, fired, and erased, standing in the center of the lobby being acknowledged by a uniformed security officer with the ceremonial respect reserved for active military command. The doors opened again at 7:11 p.m. The man who entered was 63 years old, with silver hair cut in a military fade and shoulders that had never forgotten how to carry authority. Two-star Admiral Courtney Hayes. He wore dress blues. 3 rows of ribbons climbed his chest. Behind him walked a woman holding a classified file folder, manila and worn and stamped with so many redaction markings that the corners were black with ink. The Admiral's eyes found Rachel immediately. Muscle memory. Tactical assessment. Command presence that made the air pressure change. Master Chief Torres, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. His voice moved through the lobby like a command on the radio, clear and unavoidable. These are your service records. I've brought them forward by presidential authorization. We're about to read them into official record in front of witnesses. I suggest everyone present listen carefully. Dr. Whitfield's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. The Admiral opened the file. His voice carried the cadence of ceremony, each decoration pronounced separately, each one allowed its own moment of weight. 3 Navy crosses for valor under fire. The lobby exhaled. 2 Bronze Stars for tactical leadership. Mitchell nodded slowly, his jaw tight. 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds sustained in active operations. Rachel's hands remained at her sides. Steady. 15 combat deployments with Naval Special Warfare Command, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Reconnaissance Element attached to JSOC Task Force 121. The Admiral paused. He looked directly at Whitfield. Classified Service Record, 2002 through 2006, retroactively unsealed this morning by order of the Director of Naval Intelligence, based on documentation provided by Master Chief Torres that triggered a federal investigation into fraudulent billing practices at this hospital, specifically kickback arrangements with contracted laboratories and unnecessary cardiac enzyme panels ordered on stable pediatric patients. The folder closed with the sound of a courtroom gavel. Whitfield's hand moved toward his pocket. It stopped. His breath came shallow and fast. You have no authority here, he said. His voice had lost its condescending edge. It was thin now. Panicked. That procedure was unauthorized. She violated protocol. She. Dr. James Whitfield, the Admiral said, and the way he said the name made it sound like something you'd scrape off your shoe. Your credentials at Seattle General are hereby revoked effective immediately. Your visiting privileges are terminated. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation by the State Board. You are being escorted from this premises by security. Mitchell stepped forward. He wasn't alone. 2 other guards moved with him, flanking the doctor with the casual precision of people who'd done this before. Whitfield's phone buzzed again. And again. And again. His face had gone the color of old plaster. He looked at Rachel one final time, expecting something: anger, vindication, triumph. But her face remained composed, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. She gave him nothing. She simply watched as he was walked toward the exit, his protests dissolving into the ambient noise of the hospital, his voice becoming just another sound in the evening crush. The mute boy's mother had waited in the crowd, standing near the information desk, holding her son's hand. When Whitfield was gone and the doors had closed behind him, she stepped forward. Her name was Dr. Sarah Malik. Her son, Aidan, stood beside her in a wheelchair, still recovering, still young, but alive. His eyes were alert. They tracked Rachel with recognition and something beyond gratitude. Something that looked like understanding. Dr. Malik's face was wet with tears that she made no effort to wipe away. She spoke directly, her voice carrying across the lobby in the way that important truths do. 20 years ago, a Navy medic pulled my newborn son from a collapsed building in Ramadi. There was fire. There were bodies. There was chaos. This woman, she gestured to Rachel, this woman carried my son through the smoke and placed him in his father's arms. My husband kept a photograph of that moment his entire life. A woman in combat gear, her face covered, but her eyes visible. He called her the Angel of Ramadi. He said if it wasn't for her, none of us would exist. Her son looked up at Rachel. His mouth opened. And for the first time in 8 years, Aidan Malik spoke. Thank you. The words were small and careful and perfect. They filled the lobby like light. Rachel's eyes closed for exactly one breath. When they opened, her voice came quiet and steady. You're going to be fine, petty officer. You're going to walk out of here. You're going to talk. You're going to live a full life. Aidan nodded solemnly, accepting the promotion in rank with the grace of a child who understood that some people carry authority in their presence, not their titles. The Admiral turned to the gathered crowd. He raised his voice. Master Chief Torres is reinstated to active duty as a training instructor with Naval Special Warfare Command effective immediately. Her service record is cleared. Her rank is restored. Her security clearance is upgraded. Effective today, she reports to the Director of Naval Medicine. That is all. The crowd began to move. Nurses embraced her. Orderlies stepped forward. The translator, Amira Hassan, discharged from the ER against medical advice, having received the only medicine he actually needed, crossed the lobby and embraced her fiercely, calling her Valkyrie, telling her again and again that she had given him a life worth living. But Rachel stood still through all of it, her hands receiving the embraces without initiating them, her face the mask of someone who had learned long ago that composure was armor. 6 months later, the commissioning ceremony took place on a clear San Diego morning. The new Naval Hospital Wing, the Rachel Torres Memorial Wing, though she'd spent 45 minutes in the Admiral's office insisting on naming it for the medics who never came home, gleamed in the Pacific sunlight like a promise kept. Rachel stood in dress whites. Her uniform fit perfectly. 3 Navy crosses hung on her chest. 2 bronze stars. The medals were no longer classified. They were visible. They were real. Aidan Malik stood beside his mother in the front row. He wore a small Navy dress uniform that fit him like he'd been born into it. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder. The Iraqi translator sat with other coalition veterans, his face restored by physical therapy, his words no longer slurred, his voice carrying the weight of testimony. Rachel's daughter, Maya, stood to the side wearing a Navy cross on loan, pinned to her dress, finally understanding the boots, finally understanding why her mother's hands had always known how to hold broken things together. The Admiral stood at the podium. He'd read the service record again, condensed this time, public this time, the whole gallery bearing witness. When he finished, he looked directly at Rachel. Master Chief, you have a message for the families. Rachel moved to the podium. Her voice carried across the grass and out toward the ocean, where the morning wind moved like a living thing. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She paused. She looked at Aidan, who was sitting up straight now, his hand still resting in his mother's. That boy is alive because someone decided to act when it would have been easier to follow orders. He's alive because a man in this room, she nodded to the Admiral, trusted a classified record over a convenient lie. He's alive because his mother never stopped believing he could speak again. Class is what you do when no one is watching. When the cameras are off. When the award isn't coming. When the recognition doesn't exist. You do it anyway, because the alternative is looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. The ceremony ended at 11:33 a.m. That same afternoon, 300 miles away in San Diego, Dr. James Whitfield sat at a plastic table in the break room of San Diego Community College, watching the ceremony on his phone during his lunch hour. His CPR class waited for him in the next room. Disinterested students, most of them taking the certification as a checkbox for nursing prerequisites. He taught them chest compressions on plastic dummies. His hands shook now. They'd started shaking 6 months ago, the day his credentials were revoked, the day his wife filed for divorce, the day his medical license was suspended pending investigation. His car was a rusted 2009 Hyundai. His apartment was a studio with water stains on the ceiling. His salary was minimum wage plus a modest commission if students passed their exams, which they rarely did. He taught alone. He ate lunch alone. He drove home alone. On his phone screen, Rachel Torres stood in dress whites, surrounded by people who recognized her, who respected her, who would spend the rest of their lives understanding that true authority comes from knowing when to act and having the courage to act anyway. Whitfield's phone went dark. He finished his sandwich. He returned to the classroom and taught chest compressions to students who would never know his name. Meanwhile, in the new hospital wing, the final detail was being installed, a glass display case set into the wall of the main corridor. Inside, a pair of combat boots. They were worn. Sand still filled the treads. The laces were frayed. A plaque beneath read, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. Call sign, Valkyrie. Angel of Ramadi. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The mute boy who had learned to speak stood in front of the display case with his mother, reading the words carefully, understanding finally that the quiet woman who worked in silence and carried others' burdens was the same woman whose boots had walked through fire to bring him into the world. Subscribe. Like. Comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength.